Chapter 1: The Morning Nobody Came. On the morning of the 3rd of February, 1637, a flower auction was held in the Dutch city of Haarlem. Nobody came. The auctioneer stood in a cold tavern, a table of bulbs before him, small, ugly, unremarkable things, each one priced at figures that would have bought a craftsman's house, a merchant's ship, a nobleman's carriage. And the room was empty. In the space of a single morning, the greatest speculative craze in human history came to a silent, catastrophic end. No panic. No shouting. No explosion. Just a table of unsold flowers, and a silence that meant ruin for thousands. This is the story of Tulip Mania, the world's first financial bubble. A story about greed, delusion, and the terrifying speed at which both can unravel. It begins, as most great disasters do, with something beautiful. To understand why flowers drove an entire nation to the edge of financial ruin, you must first understand where this story takes place. Amsterdam in the 1630s was, by almost any measure, the most prosperous city in the world. The Dutch Republic had spent the previous century building a commercial empire that stretched from the Spice Islands of the East Indies to the Hudson River of the New World. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the most powerful corporation ever created. Its ships moved between continents. Its profits were staggering. Amsterdam's merchant class was flush with capital, and capital, as it always does, looked for somewhere to go. Into property. Into art. Into luxury goods from the far corners of the globe. The Dutch had money, they had confidence, and they had an insatiable appetite for things that were rare, beautiful, and difficult to obtain. Into this world, in the early 1590s, arrived something that fit every one of those criteria perfectly. A flower, unlike any the Dutch had ever seen. Chapter 2: The Flower That Seduced a City. The tulip was not Dutch. It arrived in Western Europe in the 1590s from the Ottoman Empire, from the imperial gardens of Constantinople, carried west by a Flemish botanist named Carolus Clusius. To European eyes, it was unlike anything they had ever grown. Most European flowers were modest things, roses, lilies, simple shapes. The tulip was theatrical. It stood tall on a straight stem. It opened in a perfect cup. Its petals came in colors that seemed almost artificially vivid, deep reds, rich purples, bold yellows, sometimes 2 or 3 colors in a single bloom. Clusius planted them at the botanical garden in Leiden. And they were immediately stolen. The demand was so intense, so immediate, that his bulbs were ripped from the ground before he could study them properly. He spent years rebuilding his collection as cultivators across the country began growing their own. Wealthy Dutch collectors began paying premiums for rare varieties. Status, at the time, was measured not just in houses and ships, but in gardens. And the tulip was the most spectacular garden ornament money could buy. Then something strange happened to some of the flowers. Certain tulips began producing blooms unlike anything seen before. Instead of a single solid color, their petals would burst with intricate, flame-like patterns, red bleeding into white, purple feathering through yellow, streaks and swirls of color that seemed almost impossible for a living thing to produce. Collectors called them broken tulips. They were considered the most beautiful flowers in existence. The most famous of all was the Semper Augustus, white petals with dramatic crimson flames running through them, edged with a fine line of blue that seemed to shimmer in the light. It was considered the most perfect flower ever grown. What nobody understood, what science would not discover for another 300 years, was that this breathtaking beauty was caused by a virus. A mosaic virus carried by aphids, infecting the bulbs and corrupting their pigment. The most prized, most valuable, most obsessed over flowers in Holland were sick. And because the virus weakened the bulbs, the broken tulips reproduced slowly. Slowly meant scarce. Scarce meant expensive. Expensive meant desirable. The trap was set. By the early 1630s, a formal market in tulip bulbs had begun to take shape. It was not organized or regulated. It happened in taverns, in markets, in private rooms, wherever buyers and sellers could find each other. The mechanics were straightforward. Tulips bloom in spring. Bulbs are dug up and traded in summer. By autumn, new bulbs are planted. This meant there were only a few months each year when the actual flower could change hands. Specialist growers built relationships with wealthy collectors. Prices for the rarest varieties climbed steadily year on year. A Semper Augustus bulb sold for 1,000 guilders in 1623. That was roughly equal to the annual income of a skilled Amsterdam craftsman. 10 years later, the same variety would sell for more than 5,000 guilders. Then 10,000. The market was not irrational, not yet. Rare flowers commanded premium prices. The wealthy paid for exclusivity. That was normal. What happened next was not normal. Because the market attracted a new class of participant. Not collectors. Not horticulturalists. Not wealthy nobles with garden estates. Speculators. Chapter 3: Trading what doesn't exist. The speculator does not love the flower. He does not care about rarity, beauty, or cultivation. He cares about one thing, that the price tomorrow will be higher than the price today. By 1634, a new wave of buyers had entered the tulip market who had no intention of ever growing the flowers they purchased. They were merchants, tradesmen, and eventually ordinary working men and women who had heard that fortunes were being made in bulbs, and who wanted a share. They bought bulbs at a price. Then they sold them to the next buyer, at a higher price. Then that buyer sold to the next. As long as someone was always willing to pay more, the system worked. And in the mid-1630s, someone was always willing to pay more. Stories spread through Amsterdam like fire. A sailor had been given a Semper Augustus bulb as payment for a voyage and eaten it, mistaking it for an onion, worth 10 years of his wages, consumed in a single meal. A speculator had turned a 200 guilder investment into 6,000 in a single season. These stories drew in more buyers. More buyers pushed prices higher. Higher prices drew in more buyers. The feedback loop had begun. The mechanics of the tulip market had always been limited by one physical reality: bulbs could only be bought and sold in summer when they were out of the ground. For the rest of the year, the market was frozen. Speculators found a way around this. They invented what we now call futures contracts. A buyer would pay a deposit on a bulb that was still in the ground, still growing, and agree to purchase it at a fixed price when it was dug up in the following summer. The seller would agree to deliver it. Both parties were betting on what the price would be when the contract came due. This was a financial instrument so new that the Dutch legal system had no framework for it. Nobody was entirely sure these contracts were even enforceable in a court of law. Buyers and sellers both understood this. And yet the contracts multiplied. By 1636, the tulip market had become almost entirely abstract. People were trading flowers that hadn't bloomed yet. Bulbs that hadn't been dug up. Prices that existed only on paper. The market was no longer connected to flowers. It was connected only to the shared belief that prices would keep rising. That is the definition of a bubble. By the winter of 1636, the tulip market had reached a state of collective madness. The prices being recorded in ledgers across Holland read less like market data and more like hallucinations. A single Semper Augustus bulb changed hands for 10,000 guilders. That was the price of a grand house on Amsterdam's finest canal, complete with a garden and carriage house. 10,000 guilders. For one flower bulb. The Viceroy variety, another rare broken tulip, sold for an assortment of goods that a contemporary account lists in precise detail: 2 loads of wheat, for loads of rye, for fat oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, for barrels of beer, 2 barrels of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed, some clothing, and a silver cup. All of this, in exchange for a single bulb. Common bulbs that had been worth a few guilders the previous year were now changing hands for hundreds. The price of every variety had risen sharply, even the ordinary ones, because the market had decided that all tulips would rise forever. At the exact moment that everyone believed this most deeply, it was already over. Chapter 4: The Day the Bubble Burst. What happened in the final months of 1636 was unlike anything Holland had seen. The tulip market had escaped the merchant class entirely and spread into every layer of Dutch society. Weavers sold their looms. Chimney sweeps sold everything they owned. Farmers mortgaged their land. Servants pooled their wages. The stories from this period describe a country in collective financial euphoria, entire streets where the conversation was only about bulbs, about prices, about profits. Taverns that had once sold drinks now traded contracts between rounds. Notaries had waiting lists. Lawyers grew rich writing documents nobody was certain were legally valid. Contemporary observers were horrified. A pamphlet from early 1637 described ordinary citizens who have never smelled a tulip in their lives, trading tens of thousands of guilders in flower contracts in a single afternoon. The author compared it to a fever, one that had infected the rational Dutch mind without warning and without mercy. The participation of common people was the final signal. When the servants and the chimney sweeps are buying, the last people in the world who should be buying have already bought. The market has run out of new entrants. And without new entrants, the only direction is down. The exact mechanism of the collapse is still debated by historians. But the broad shape of what happened is clear. On the 3rd of February, 1637, a routine bulb auction was held in Haarlem. These auctions were the heartbeat of the market, regular, reliable, attended. On this particular morning, the buyers did not come. Nobody knows precisely why. The most likely explanation is prosaic: a small number of buyers, perhaps already stretched on previous contracts, declined to bid. Prices in that room failed to reach their asking levels. Word spread quickly from the auction house into the streets, into the taverns, into the canal-side offices of dealers across the city. The news was not dramatic. There was no crash, not yet. Just the quiet, terrible information that at one auction, in one city, buyers had hesitated. That hesitation was enough. In a market built entirely on the belief that prices would always go up, the first evidence that they might not go up was the equivalent of a structural failure. The confidence that had taken 3 years to build evaporated in 3 days. Everyone who had bought now wanted to sell. And there was nobody left to sell to. The collapse was not a crash in the way we picture financial crashes: no trading floor in chaos, no bells ringing, no one screaming. It was quieter than that. And in some ways, that made it worse. Over the following days and weeks, the price of tulip bulbs simply fell. Then fell further. Contracts that had been written at thousands of guilders were renegotiated or abandoned. Sellers tried to find buyers at half price. Then a quarter. Then at any price. There were no buyers. Within weeks, bulbs that had sold for 10,000 guilders were trading at 50, a collapse of 99.5%. Rare varieties that had been valued at the price of houses were being sold for the price of onions. And some could not be sold at all. The market had not corrected. It had ceased to exist. Every speculator who had bought at the peak now held contracts for flowers worth a fraction of what they owed. The weavers. The chimney sweeps. The farmers. The merchants. Everyone who had borrowed to buy. Everyone who had sold their real assets for paper profits. Every single one of them was now facing the real arithmetic of what had happened. Chapter 5: The Pattern That Never Changes. The collapse left behind a landscape of broken contracts and impossible debts that the Dutch legal system was completely unprepared to handle. Buyers who had agreed to purchase bulbs at peak prices refused to honor their contracts. Sellers who had delivered bulbs were not paid. Speculators who had borrowed capital to fund their trading could not repay their loans. The legal chambers of every major Dutch city were flooded with tulip contract disputes, and the courts quickly realized they faced an impossible task. Many of the contracts, having been written during the winter when bulbs were in the ground, had been classified under Dutch law as option contracts, essentially, gambling debts. Under this classification, courts could not legally compel buyers to honor them. The contracts were, technically, unenforceable. In April 1637, the Dutch government attempted to resolve the crisis by decreeing that all tulip futures contracts written after November 1636 would be voided, essentially annulling the entire peak period of trading. Buyers would be released from their obligations for a payment of 10% of the contract value. It was a pragmatic solution. It was also a quiet admission that the state had watched its citizens build a financial system on a foundation of nothing, and now had to dismantle it by decree. History remembers Tulip Mania as a curiosity, an amusing example of collective irrationality. A lesson about greed. A cautionary tale made safe by its distance from us. But behind the numbers and the contracts and the court decrees were individual human lives that were comprehensively destroyed. Contemporary records describe families losing homes they had owned for generations. Tradesmen whose businesses took decades to build, liquidated in months of speculation, gone in weeks of collapse. Farmers who had mortgaged productive land their fathers and grandfathers had farmed, now dispossessed, with no means to recover it. The weaver who sold his loom had no way to earn a living once his investment evaporated. The loom was not replaceable from what remained. The merchant who had bought at 10,000 guilders and held through the collapse, believing the market would recover, watched the value of his holdings fall to almost nothing over a single spring season. There are few accounts of suicides, fewer of bankruptcies than you might expect, partly because the legal voiding of contracts spread some of the pain across both sides of each transaction. But the psychological toll was enormous and poorly documented, as it always is when ordinary people suffer financial catastrophe through trusting a system that failed them. Tulip Mania ended in the spring of 1637. But it never really ended. In 1720, it was shares in the South Sea Company. In 1929, it was American stocks. In 2000, it was internet companies. In 2008, it was mortgages packaged into financial instruments so complex that the people selling them could not explain what they were. Most recently, it has been cryptocurrency and meme stocks, and AI companies trading at valuations that defy every historical precedent. The mechanism is always the same. A real asset, or a genuine innovation, attracts rational investment. Early investors profit. Stories spread. New participants arrive who are not interested in the underlying value, only in the rising price. The rising price attracts more participants. The market becomes abstract. Then a buyer hesitates. Then another. Then the room is empty, and the auctioneer is standing in the cold with a table full of things nobody wants to buy. What changes is the flower. What never changes is the human being holding it, certain, absolutely certain, that this time is different. It never is. This was Gilded Ruin.